So today we're having a look at the 1950s, and these are some of the little program things I put out to, some of the shares I put out for daily discussion on the news groups in Lethbridge Memories and Lethbridge Historical Society and one other one. So let's go on and have a look. We're going to start with people today, and the first guy that's going to come up is Mr. Reithman. Mr. Reithman came to southern Alberta, I believe it was in the late 40s. But anyway, we ran across him when he painted our home. But he was also well known in the community as very artistic. He had been from Switzerland. I believe he was a Mormon convert, came over to southern Alberta. And besides my home, he did the work on the Hague Clinic, where he painted some major contributors to medicine over the history. And that was the year that the Hague Clinic opened in 1950. Notice that there was Frederick Banting, discoverer of insulin, or co-discoverer of insulin, Rontgen, X-rays, Jenner, vaccination, Hippocrates, founder of medicine, Louis Pasteur, pasteurization, Lister, surgical techniques, and Osler, who's revolutionized medical education. Next, we're going to have a look at some of the items that were on the wall at home. This is a Piper Cub, and I was just a little wee one at the time, and I couldn't figure out exactly why a Piper Cub showed up on my wall as much as I loved it. But later on, I discovered that in 1947, the Piper Cub made the first flight around the world in a little personal aircraft, and it is now on display at the Smithsonian. So obviously in 1947 must be the year I got it on the wall, because there was a lot of publicity about the Piper Cub at that time. Here's C.S. Noble, who in the early part of the century had amassed a great farm empire. He was originally from Claresholm. Unfortunately, it got all eaten up, and he owed money from the bank when things got tough in the 20s. He lost everything. He rented back the land that he had lost and managed to save up money and buy it back. In the meantime, in 1935, he had gone down to the United States, and the Depression was on, agriculture was not doing well, and he discovered that they were cultivating with a system where they would cut the roots off and allow the top part of the carrots and so on to stay above the ground and stop the erosion and keep the moisture. So he came back to Alberta, and he designed a cultivator, became the Noble cultivator. It started to be sold in 1937. He did very well, and Nobleford is named after him. Here you can see the statue at Nobleford. He was eventually awarded an honorary degree from the University of Alberta in 1952. This next item I find quite fascinating. He was a man who has a lot of imagination on how to farm. To get from his farm to the railway would have been an 18-mile haul. So he developed this system to get over the river. You can see up at the top here, there's a bridge. He would take his grain and send it down this chute, and there it would get into a bucket, and the bucket would be pulled across the river, dumped into this item here, and put into wagons and then hauled away. Next, we're going to look at some of the high school people that were at the time I was at high school and how well they have done. The first fellow is a man named Barry Clark, who was a good friend of mine. And if you go to the front door of the LCI today, you will see this little sketch here, and it's based on the original logo for the school. And he designed this back in about 1953, I would say. Here he is down here. He was the artist for the school spotlight, the yearly book. And it's still being used. You can see he was quite into the art, especially modern art at the time. This is the dining room at his home. His mother and father let him paint the wall, which is more than I can say mine would have. Then he painted the outside of the house, and you can see the story and modern art. This is all gone now, unfortunately. One afternoon, on Sunday afternoon, I was sitting over with him just chewing the fat there in the afternoon garden, and these are sketches he made of them. This is a car. Kids are always into cars. This is a sketch he made of me sitting down in the lounge, the table in the backyard, flowers on the table, and so on. This is probably done at the same time. This is sketching some of the teachers. He just did it. I don't think he had the yearbook in front of him at the time. He just, from imagination, these are the teachers we had at the time. If you want to take the time, see if you can match up the faces with the actual sheet from the yearbook. It's quite easy if you get into it. Last I heard of him, he was at a delegate giving a speech at a digital cinema festival in China. We made a movie back in the mid-50s on one Sunday afternoon, and I guess he must have taken it quite seriously. He went into film after he had gone to McGill to take science, and then had a scholarship to Harvard, gave it up, went to India to find himself, I guess. Came back, went to Los Angeles. I remember he had a job taking dogs into some sort of an experiment to see how they reacted under certain conditions. Anyway, he ended up in film, and the next time I ran into him was about 30 years later, where I went to a movie at IMAX about Galapagos Islands, and discovered that it had been made by Barry Clark, the same person I'd gone to high school with. So he did very well. Last I heard, he was still in Los Angeles. Lauren Blackburn was a well-known teacher at the LCI for many, many years. His son, Brian, who was a few years younger than me but did live down the street, went into forensic medicine and became rather well known at the time of the Heaven's Gate catastrophe. Had to do the autopsies of the Hale-Bopp comet episode, which is a religious group that went a little on the nutty side, I would say. If you want to read about it, it's quite the bizarre story. Dale Bartlett, although he never went to the LCI, he was, I believe, from Wilson Siding, just outside of Lethbridge, and he was a very, very talented piano player. Expected, when I took piano lessons, he was always saying, look, you study hard and you may become like Dale Bartlett. Well, I tried hard, but I never became anything at the piano. In the meantime, he went to become one of the international, famous international players. He studied around, I guess, a lot in Europe, and he ended up teaching at the University of Ottawa and McGill. Another person from southern Alberta at the time was this man here, Huntley Brown. Huntley Brown went into commercial art. He was at the School of Art down, I believe it was in Toronto. He is best known, in my book, as far as I know, best known for his compilation of artistic work for the Centennial series that came out in 1967, and here are some of the illustrations that you can see from that particular book. Here's some others. Then we have another fellow who's a couple of years above me in school. This was Dennis Burton. He also went down east and studied art at Ontario College of Art, graduated in 1956, and went to University in Southern California. He ended up working for the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, and then rose to artistic fame for his controversial paintings of female undergarments and what became known as garter belt mania. Again, you can Google his work. There he is there. The picture at the bottom shows his home on 13th Street between 6th and 7th Avenue. Artist Don Frake, this is a more traditional type artist for sure. And here are a bunch of the pictures that you can see that he did over the years. He lived for a long time in Coaldale, although at one time he just lived down the street from me, near where Fleetwood School is. Harold Coward also went to school with me. Harold Coward obviously went into the church. He was a United Church minister, but he became famous when he became an outstanding academic studying Eastern religions. In 1997, he was described as arguably the most dynamic religion scholar in Canada today. He became director of the Centre for Studies of Religion and Society at the University of Victoria and edited an awful lot of books. These are some of the books that he put out on religion. He was into world religions. Now, Howard Ritchie was kind of a showman in high school. He put on his own show at the Capitol Theatre, had a fellow student who was a singer, Barbara Simpson, and he did magic acts, I believe. And I was down east at the time, so we thought that he was going to become big in show business, but he ended up going into medicine, and I believe he practiced down in the eastern United States. He died quite a few years ago. So those are some of the people that I've put in on the daily basis of people that have done well in their fields and adjoining fields over the years. Next part that I wanted to talk about are some of the places. And these are each day, as I say, I put something out. In 1950, the Fritz Sick Pool opened at the Civic Center. And I simply says, does anyone have any memories to share of that? Because up until that time, Southside residents only had the lake to go to, which meant that you could get a few bloodsuckers and the itch and all that kind of stuff. And it was a pretty big deal when they opened up a pool, an ordinary pool in the Civic Center. Well, lots of people responded to that one, so it was a big deal. Canyon Church Camp. I had gone to Canyon Church Camp, a young people's camp, when I was in high school, and it just so happened back in 2014, there was an article in the paper saying that they were going to have a big reunion. So Joan and I, my wife, we went down there and had a look at the spots that I had visited back when I was in high school. These are pictures from that period. And this is pictures from when our visit was a few years ago. Now, that was in 2014. About 2 or 3 years later, there was a big forest fire in that area, and much of this was changed, I'm sure, although I haven't been back to see. And this is the 9th Avenue Shopping Center, which was one of the first outlier shopping centers in at least this part of Lethbridge. And it's interesting to see the various buildings along the top. The only one that is still there is Stubbs Pharmacy, I believe. That's still operational. And that happened around 1949, somewhere in there, that they built that mall. Now, puzzles. This is a puzzle I put out. I think I took 3 areas and simply erased them from the photograph. It was all done digitally. And then I asked the people to tell me what things were not in it. Now, these are people that are quite into the history, and these aerial photographs I was hoping would inspire them to see if they could figure out what I had erased. Well, here are the things that I took out. I took out Fleetwood School, I took out St. Joseph's School, High School, and Alan Watson School. The one that gave them the most trouble was trying to discover this little guy here. Next, I did the same thing again, but this was even tougher. I had erased different parts. I erased this part here, I believe. Let's have a look. Nope, it was this part, the sheds. I had taken out the sheds. Let's have a back look. Yeah, see there it's been taken out. And there it's back. I took out the arena. Yeah, there it is. It had been taken out. And I also had eradicated Galbraith School. Yep, it's not there. Next, some events. These are events I had played in the band back in around 1950 when they opened up the first Safeway store in this area. And then years later it was changed to Consumers Distributing, which is now also long gone. This was a Fizzackerly, who was a young fellow who ended up robbing a bank in Lethbridge, and it was a pretty big deal. And they chased him across and discovered him in Mexico. I think that was a weekend thing. When the weekend came, he just ran off with the money, and when they discovered it Monday morning, there was the big deal. There's the bank as it is. So that was in 1955. So this bank had been redeveloped, I guess, by that time. And this little section was put in, I wanted to compare the religious pages with today, compared with what they were like back in the 50s. And you can see that in the 1950s it took up a whole page of church activities, but by 2016 a large amount had been switched over to the animals, cats and the dogs, and not much left of the faith period. Getting around, this is about a car crash that occurred in Lethbridge, just outside of my home, back in 1955. I remember coming back from an evening on the weekend and discovering all the activity that had taken place at the corner. And you can read about it. It was a pretty sad event. This is the Lanier Farm, just outside of Lethbridge. And again, the Laniers were much into looking after the land the proper way. And this was a stamp that was made based on this photograph of the Lanier Farm. Minstrel shows, one of the last ones to appear in this area, minstrel show of the Rotary Club. And these are now considered taboo.